Michael Whitmore looked his wife directly in the eyes across that courtroom and smiled. Not a nervous smile, not an apologetic smile, a slow, deliberate smile that said, "I already won, and you don't even know it yet." Emily Carter gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. 18 years, 3 children, everything she had ever built, and he was sitting there smiling like she was nothing, like she had always been nothing. If this story made your heart stop for a second, you're not alone. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Emily Carter woke up on the morning of the first day of her divorce trial, the same way she had woken up every morning for the last 6 months, with her heart already pounding before she opened her eyes. It was not fear exactly. It was something older than fear, something that had been living in her chest since the night Michael sat across from her at their kitchen table, folded his hands together the way he always did when he had already made a decision, and said very quietly, very calmly, "I think we both know this marriage is over." She had stared at him. She remembered the sound of the refrigerator humming. She remembered that their youngest daughter had left a crayon drawing on the counter, a purple house with yellow windows. She remembered thinking this cannot be happening right now. She remembered thinking, say something, Emily, say something. And then she remembered the silence, her own silence, stretching out between them like a wound that had been there for a long time and had only just been named. That was 6 months ago. Now she was sitting in the 3rd row of a federal courthouse bathroom applying lipstick in a mirror that had a crack running through the lower left corner, trying to remember how to breathe. Her attorney, Rachel Morgan, knocked twice and pushed open the door. Rachel was 41 years old, sharp-jawed with the kind of eyes that made witnesses fidget without her saying a single word. She had been practicing family law for 15 years. She had seen every trick. She had seen every lie. She had sat across from men like Michael Whitmore before, and she had not always won, but she had always made them work for it. "We need to talk before we go in," Rachel said, standing beside Emily with her arms crossed and a manila folder pressed against her chest. "Tell me it's going to be okay," Emily said. She was not asking. She already knew Rachel would not say it that way. "I'm going to tell you what I know," Rachel said. "His financial disclosure is clean on the surface, too clean, the kind of clean that takes months of planning. His attorney is David Park. He's good, Emily. I'm not going to pretend he isn't. Michael is going to walk in there looking like a man who has lost everything, and he's going to be very convincing because he has had a long time to practice." Emily looked at herself in the mirror. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who had spent 6 months doubting every memory she had ever trusted. "But here's what I also know," Rachel said. "Liars make mistakes, not big ones usually, small ones, the kind that don't matter until suddenly they matter very much. I need you to stay calm out there. I need you to not react no matter what he says. Can you do that?" Emily thought about Michael's smile. She thought about the way it had looked on that first morning in court, that relaxed, almost bored expression, like a man watching a movie he had already seen. "I can do that," she said. She did not know yet whether she was telling the truth. The courtroom on the first morning was already half full when Emily walked in. She did not look at Michael immediately. She had made herself a rule: do not look at him until you have to, because looking at him did something to her that she could not afford right now. It made her remember the man she had married at 26, the one who used to make her laugh so hard she cried, the one who had held her hand through 3 deliveries and called her the bravest person he had ever known. Looking at him made the grief rise up before the anger did, and grief right now was a luxury she could not afford. She sat down. She organized her papers. She took a slow breath, and then she looked up. Michael was already watching her, and he was smiling. It was small, controlled, the kind of smile that only she would recognize as intentional, the kind he used when he wanted her to know, without saying it out loud, that he was in control of the situation. He had used that smile on her for years. At dinner parties when she said something he did not approve of. During arguments when he had already decided the outcome. On the night he told her the marriage was over. Emily turned away. She pressed her hand flat against the table in front of her and breathed. She would not give him this. Not today. The judge's name was Honorable Charles Benton. He was 62 years old, heavy-set with reading glasses that he kept taking on and off throughout the proceedings in a way that Emily would eventually learn meant he was thinking very hard about something. He had been a family court judge for 18 years. He had presided over hundreds of divorces, bitter ones, quiet ones, where both people sat across from each other looking exhausted and sad and relieved. He had seen wealthy men try to hide assets before. He had seen women stripped of everything they deserved. He had developed over the years a very particular kind of patience, the patience of a man who had learned that the truth, when it existed, had a tendency to surface eventually like air bubbles rising through water. He had also developed it over the years, an instinct for men like Michael Whitmore. He could not have articulated exactly what triggered it, something in the posture, something in the eyes, something in the too perfect neatness of the story being told. He noticed it on the first morning when Michael's attorney, David Park, stood up and began presenting his client as a man humbled by misfortune. "Your Honor," David Park said, "my client Michael Whitmore built his construction business over 2 decades through hard work and personal sacrifice. Through no fault of his own, a catastrophic business failure has left him in significant financial distress. The petitioner is asking this court to award assets that no longer exist. My client has already lost nearly everything. What she is asking for is the remainder." Judge Benton took off his glasses. He looked at Michael Whitmore. Michael looked back at him with that same calm, polite expression. His suit was charcoal gray, his shoes were polished, his tie was silk, though you would have had to look closely to notice. The judge put his glasses back on. He wrote something at the top of his notepad. He did not say what it was, but he circled it twice. Rachel Morgan began her opening statement by doing something unusual. She did not attack. She did not make accusations. She did not wave documents or strike emotional poses. She stood up calmly, walked to the center of the room and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to tell you about Emily Carter, not as a petitioner, not as a number on a financial statement, but as a person." The room went quiet. Emily Carter married Michael Whitmore when she was 26 years old. She had a degree in business administration and a job offer from a marketing firm that would have paid her $60,000 a year. She turned it down. Michael had a small construction business that was struggling. He needed help with the books, with the scheduling, with the client relationships. Emily helped him, not as an employee, as a wife, as a partner. She paused. Over the next 18 years, while Michael's name went on every contract and every license, Emily was the person who kept the lights on. She tracked the cash flow. She managed the vendor relationships. She made sure the payroll was covered when the accounts were thin. She raised 3 children. She turned down career opportunities twice more because the timing never worked for the family. Emily did not look at Michael. And then, Rachel said quietly, something happened. The business that Emily helped build suddenly very conveniently collapsed. The accounts that she had helped maintain were suddenly empty. The assets that both of them had spent 18 years building were suddenly, according to Michael Whitmore, simply gone. Rachel turned and looked directly at Michael. "We are here today because Emily Carter deserves to understand where everything went, and I believe, Your Honor, that by the time this trial concludes, this court will understand it too." Michael's expression did not change, but Emily, watching him from the corner of her eye, saw something that almost nobody else in the room would have noticed. His left hand, resting on the table, curled slowly into a fist. The first witness called to the stand was Thomas Klein, Michael's former business partner. Thomas was a soft-spoken man in his early 50s who looked deeply uncomfortable being in the room. He had built the Whitmore Klein Construction Partnership alongside Michael for 11 years before a disagreement over profit-sharing had ended their professional relationship 3 years ago. He had agreed to testify reluctantly, Emily knew, only after Rachel had made clear that the subpoena gave him no choice. David Park had clearly coached Michael about Thomas. When Thomas walked to the stand, Michael's eyes followed him, and the smile took on a very slight different quality, the quality of a man recalculating. Rachel stood and approached Thomas with her notepad. "Mr. Klein," she said, "you partnered with Michael Whitmore for over a decade. In your time working together, would you describe the Whitmore Klein Construction Company as financially healthy?" Thomas shifted in his seat. "Yes, for the majority of those years, yes." "When you ended your partnership, what was the state of the company's assets?" Thomas hesitated. At that point, the company held approximately $4 million in contracts, pending equipment valued at around $2.3 million, and cash reserves somewhere between $800,000 and $1 million, depending on the month. A small murmur moved through the room. "And that was 3 years ago," Rachel said. "Yes." Mr. Klein, in the 18 months before your partnership ended, did Michael ever discuss plans to restructure the business, to move assets, to create a new holding company? David Park stood immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. I'll allow it, Judge Benton said, still writing. The witness may answer. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands. Yes, he said finally. He mentioned it. He said he was thinking about creating a separate holding structure for liability purposes. I didn't think much of it at the time. It's a common practice. Did he mention a specific company name? Thomas hesitated again. Just a half second. The kind of hesitation that is very small and means everything. He mentioned something called Whitstone Holdings. The room was silent. Rachel let the silence sit for exactly 3 seconds. Thank you, Mr. Klein, she said. No further questions. Michael looked at David Park. David Park did not look back. Emily wrote Whitstone Holdings on her notepad and circled it. During the lunch recess, Emily sat in a small conference room down the hall from the courtroom with Rachel, 2 paralegals and a cold cup of coffee she kept forgetting to drink. He looked worried, she said. For about 4 seconds, Rachel said. He recovered fast. He's disciplined. What is Whitstone Holdings? Rachel set down her pen. That's what we're trying to prove. Our investigator found a company registered under that name in Delaware filed 18 months ago. The registered agent is a law firm that Michael has used before. The listed owner is a name I've never heard, could be a shell, could be someone he trusts. We can't trace the ownership completely through public records. But the tax documents, that's what I'm working toward, Rachel said. Thomas gave us the name on the record. That's step 1. She tapped her finger on the table. But Michael is going to come back this afternoon with an explanation. He's had months to prepare for this. He's going to say the holding company was a failed concept, that nothing was ever transferred, that Thomas misunderstood. Emily looked at the table. He's going to smile. Yes, Rachel said. He's going to smile. Is there anything that can stop him? Rachel was quiet for a moment. The IRS requires asset disclosures. If Michael ever formally reported ownership of Whitstone Holdings to the federal government, and I mean ever even once then, whatever he tells this court about not controlling those assets is contradicted by what he told the government. Emily stared at her. Do you have that? Rachel picked up her coffee. I'm waiting on one more document. When they reconvened in the afternoon, Michael took the stand. David Park walked him through his story with the practiced ease of 2 people who had rehearsed it so many times it almost sounded like memory. The failed project, the client lawsuit, the domino effect of debt and loss that had spiraled out of control over 14 months. Michael spoke quietly with occasional pauses, with the expression of a man who had accepted difficult circumstances and moved on. How was Emily thought, watching him from across the room, remarkable. He looked like someone you would believe, someone you would feel sorry for, someone whose eyes carried just enough weight to make the story land. She watched 3 members of the gallery people who had nothing to do with the case, who were simply in the building for other proceedings, and she could see on their faces the slow, almost invisible nod of people who were being convinced. She hated that she understood why. She had believed him once too, for a very long time. Then Rachel stood up. She walked slowly to the center of the room, and the entire atmosphere shifted the way it does when a storm front moves in, not with noise, but with a change in pressure. Mr. Whitmore, she said pleasantly, you've described a very difficult period for your company. That's accurate, Michael said. And you've told this court that the company's assets are gone, that the accounts are empty, that there is essentially nothing left. That's correct. You've also described yourself as someone who is currently living modestly, making do, I believe you said, in a rented apartment managing basic expenses. Yes, Rachel nodded slowly. She walked toward the evidence table and picked up a single piece of paper. Mr. Whitmore, are you familiar with the name Whitstone Holdings? The smallest pause. I'm familiar with a concept I explored briefly, Michael said. A holding structure I considered creating. It never moved forward. It never moved forward, Rachel repeated. Correct. So Whitstone Holdings has no assets, has never held assets. Correct. Rachel nodded again. She placed the paper back on the table. Mr. Whitmore, she said, if I told you I had documentation showing that Whitstone Holdings currently holds contracts valued at over $3 million, and that those contracts were transferred from your original company over a period of 8 months, would you have any comment on that? The courtroom did not make a sound. David Park was already rising from his chair. Michael's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did something very small and very fast that Emily caught, because she had been watching his eyes for 18 years, and she knew every shade of what lived behind them. He was not afraid. He was calculating. "I would say that would be incorrect," Michael said evenly, "and I would expect to see documentation before commenting further." "Of course," Rachel said smoothly. "We'll get to the documentation." She sat down. Michael turned back to face the judge. The smile returned, and Emily, watching him, felt something cold settle in the center of her chest. Not fear, not grief. Something harder than both. She thought he still believes he's going to win, and she thought, I need Rachel to have that document. Because everything in the room right now, every moment of this afternoon, every question Rachel had asked, every answer Michael had given, with that careful, rehearsed calm, was circling around the same single point. One document. The one Rachel was waiting for. The one that would either expose everything or leave Michael Whitmore walking out of this courthouse with exactly what he had come here to take. That evening, Emily sat at her kitchen table with her 3 children after dinner. Her oldest, Daniel, was 17. He was Michael's son in the shape of his jaw and the steadiness of his eyes, and that had always made Emily love him in a way that was sometimes painful. He sat beside her now without speaking, and after a while he reached over and put his hand over hers, and she felt something break open in her chest that she had been holding very tightly together all day. Her middle child, Sophie, was 14. She had spent most of dinner asking questions that Emily could not fully answer. What happens if you lose Mom? What does that actually mean? Where would we go? And Emily had answered as honestly as she could, which meant saying, I don't know yet, but we are going to be okay, which was both the most true and most uncertain thing she had ever said. Her youngest, Grace, was 9. Grace did not fully understand what was happening. She knew that her parents were in court. She knew that something important was being decided. She had asked that morning with the direct simplicity of a 9-year-old, "Is Daddy lying?" "Mom?" Emily had sat with that question for a very long time before answering. "I think," she had finally said very carefully, "that sometimes people tell themselves stories until they believe them." Grace had thought about this. "Like how I told myself I didn't eat the last cookie even though I did." "Something like that," Emily said. Now at the kitchen table, she looked at the 3 of them. Daniel's quiet steadiness, Sophie's anxious energy, Grace's half-finished drawing of what appeared to be a courthouse with a rainbow over it, and she felt something she had not felt in months. Not hope exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something that felt like it might become hope. If Rachel had that document, if the truth as Rachel had told her the truth sometimes had been waiting somewhere all this time. Emily picked up her phone and saw a text from Rachel sent 40 minutes ago. 3 words, "We have it." She read those 3 words 4 times. Then she set the phone face down on the table because she did not want her children to see her cry, and she was going to cry. She could already feel it rising, not from grief, not from the loss and the betrayal, and the 18 years of slowly discovering that the man she had chosen had been keeping a version of himself secret from her the whole time. She was going to cry from something else, from the feeling of a door that had been locked for so long finally, after all this time, beginning to open. She picked up her coffee and held it with both hands and thought about what Rachel had told her in the very first meeting they ever had, back when Emily had walked into that office, looking like a woman who had not slept in 3 weeks and was not sure she ever would again. Rachel had said, "Liars make mistakes, small ones, the kind that don't matter until suddenly they matter very much." Michael Whitmore had spent months building his perfect story. He had been careful. He had been disciplined. He had moved assets and changed names and constructed explanations and rehearsed them until they came out sounding like the truth. But somewhere in all of that careful construction, in all of that planning and layering and covering of tracks, he had made one mistake, one document. One piece of paper that existed because the law required it to exist, because even the most careful liars still have to file taxes, still have to report assets, still have to put something on paper somewhere, and that paper had a way of surviving. The trial resumed tomorrow at 9 a.m. Emily set down her coffee. She looked at Grace's drawing the courthouse with the rainbow. She thought tomorrow. She thought 18 years. She thought about the morning she had turned down that marketing job because Michael had said, "I need you," "Em, I need you here. We can do this together." She had believed him. She had believed in together. She had believed in the version of us that he had presented to her and continued to present to her through every year of their marriage. And she had given that version of us everything she had. Every career choice, every sacrifice, every morning when she had balanced the company's books before the children woke up, and every evening when she had handled client calls after they went to bed. She had built that company too. Maybe not the way the law saw it, but she had built it. And somewhere on a piece of paper that Michael Whitmore had signed his name to, believing it would never surface in the one place it could destroy him, that truth had been waiting. It had been waiting for her. And tomorrow in that courtroom with Judge Benton's reading glasses and Rachel Morgan's voice and the silence that falls over a room when something that has been hidden finally comes into the light, the truth was going to arrive. Emily Carter set down her cup. She looked at her children, and for the first time in 6 months, she slept. Rachel Morgan arrived at the courthouse at 7:15 in the morning. That was 45 minutes before anyone else on her team. She did this on every important trial day, not because she needed the extra time to prepare, but because she needed the silence. She needed to sit in the room before it became a room full of people and strategy and performance, and she needed to think. She spread the documents across the defense table and looked at them one by one. The Whitstone Holdings registration papers, the transfer agreements, the testimony from Thomas Klein, the timeline she had reconstructed over 4 months of investigative work that had cost her firm more in billable hours than Emily Carter could ever have afforded without the contingency arrangement they had agreed to on the very first day. And then at the center of the table, she placed the document that had arrived by encrypted email at 11:47 the previous evening. A federal tax disclosure form, filed 14 months ago, signed by Michael Whitmore, listing himself as the beneficial owner of Whitstone Holdings and its associated assets. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she stacked it carefully beneath the other papers in the exact order she intended to use them, and she waited. Emily arrived at 7:58 with Daniel driving her because she had told him she needed company in the car and not to ask questions about it. He had nodded the way 17-year-old boys do when they understand more than they let on, and driven her without saying much, and when she got out, he had said quietly, "You've got this, Mom." She had not been able to respond, so she had just squeezed his arm and walked into the building. She found Rachel at the table and sat down beside her. "You slept," Rachel said, looking at her. "A little." "Good." Rachel pushed a cup of coffee across the table. "We're going to need you sharp today. Today is different from yesterday." "How different?" Rachel looked at her directly. "Yesterday I was building the frame. Today I'm putting the picture in it." Emily wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Is the document solid?" "It's a federal disclosure form bearing Michael Whitmore's signature, his tax identification number, and a declaration of beneficial ownership of Whitstone Holdings, dated 14 months ago, 3 months before he filed for divorce." Rachel paused. "The same Whitstone Holdings that, according to what he told this court yesterday, never held any assets and was simply a concept he briefly considered." The silence between them held everything that did not need to be said out loud. Emily nodded once. "Okay." "There's something else," Rachel said. She leaned forward slightly. "I received a call last night from our investigator. He found something additional, not the document itself, but a thread. The Whitstone Holdings operating accounts show regular transfers to a property management company in Nevada. The property management company is connected to a real estate holding that was purchased 11 months ago." She stopped. Emily stared at her. "He bought property while telling this court he could barely afford groceries," Rachel said. "Yes." The courtroom door opened. People began filing in. Emily looked across the room. Michael and David Park entered together. Michael was in a dark navy suit today. His posture was exactly what it had been the day before, easy-controlled the posture of a man who was certain he was standing on solid ground. He glanced at Emily. The smile came naturally, automatically, the way breathing does. Emily looked away first, not because she was retreating, because she was conserving something. She was keeping whatever was in her chest, that hard, clear thing that had been building since Rachel's 3-word text the night before. She was keeping it right where it was. She was going to need it. At exactly 9 a.m., Judge Benton entered and the room stood. He settled at the bench, put on his reading glasses, and looked at the room over the top of them with the particular expression Emily had already begun to recognize, the expression of a man sorting through information he has not finished processing. "We're resuming the matter of Carter versus Whitmore," he said. "Ms. Morgan, I believe you indicated yesterday that you had additional evidence to present." "Yes, Your Honor." "Proceed." Rachel stood. She picked up the first document, not the tax disclosure, not yet the transfer agreements, and walked it toward the bench. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence a series of asset transfer agreements between Whitmore Construction, LLC, and Whitstone Holdings, dated over a period of 8 months beginning approximately 22 months ago." David Park was on his feet before Rachel had finished the sentence. "Objection, Your Honor. The provenance of these documents has not been established. My client disputes their authenticity." Judge Benton held up one hand. "I'll hear the provenance." "These documents were obtained through a court-authorized subpoena to the Delaware Secretary of State's office," Rachel said. "The registration and transfer filings are public record." "I'll allow them," the judge said. He looked at David Park. "You'll have opportunity to cross-examine." Park sat down slowly. He leaned toward Michael and said something very quietly. Emily watched Michael's face. Whatever Park said to him, Michael received it with a small, almost imperceptible tightening around the jaw. Then the relaxed expression returned. Rachel stood at the center of the room and began to walk the court through the transfers. She was methodical. She was patient. She had the skill of someone who understood that a jury, or in this case a judge, needed to follow a path, and that the path needed to be clear. She did not rush. She did not sensationalize. She simply laid one document beside another calmly and precisely, the way you build something that is meant to last. The first transfer, 23 months ago. 3 existing construction contracts, valued at a combined $800,000, transferred from Whitmore Construction to Whitstone Holdings. The second transfer 20 months ago. Equipment inventory valued at $1.1 million, transferred through a lease agreement structured to appear as a third-party transaction. The third transfer, 17 months ago. A commercial property in Georgia, owned by Whitmore Construction, transferred to Whitstone Holdings for a listed price of $1 through an internal restructuring agreement. With each document, the room grew quieter. Not dramatically, not the way it does in movies with gasps and exclamations. It grew quieter the way rooms do when people realize they are watching something real unfold, when the fiction of one person's story begins to pull away from the fact of what actually happened, and the gap between those two things becomes visible. Michael's face remained calm. But David Park had stopped writing notes. He was simply watching Rachel, and his expression had the specific quality of a man recalculating, trying to find the angle that still worked. Judge Benton was taking off his glasses and putting them back on, twice, 3 times. Emily kept her eyes on the documents. She kept her breathing even. Rachel turned to face Michael on the stand. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "you testified yesterday that Whitstone Holdings was a concept that never moved forward, that nothing was transferred to it. Is that testimony still accurate?" Michael looked at the documents for exactly 2 seconds. "Those transfers may reflect administrative reorganizations within the business structure. That's standard practice." "Standard practice," Rachel repeated. "Yes. So you're now acknowledging that transfers did occur to Whitstone Holdings, which is different from what you told this court yesterday." A pause. "I'm clarifying." "You're clarifying." Rachel nodded slowly. "And these administrative reorganizations, did they occur before or after you began discussions with your divorce attorney?" This time the pause was longer. "I don't recall the exact timeline." "You don't recall." "That's what I said." Rachel nodded one more time. She walked back to her table. She picked up a document. She carried it to the judge's bench and then to David Park, who received it with a face that had gone very still. Then she placed a copy in front of Michael. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm showing you what has been marked as Exhibit 14. Can you tell the court what that document is?" Michael looked at it. And for one moment, the briefest fraction of a moment, something flickered across his face that was not calm and was not controlled and was not the expression of a man who had already won. It was the expression of a man who for the first time was looking at the specific thing he had been hoping would never appear. He recovered in less than 2 seconds. Emily would replay those 2 seconds in her memory for a long time afterward. They were the 2 seconds in which she watched Michael Whitmore understand that the ground beneath him was not what he had believed it to be. "It appears to be a tax disclosure form," he said. "Can you read for the court whose name appears on the signature line?" A pause. "Michael T. Whitmore. And the date? November 14th. Of which year?" Another pause. Shorter this time. 14 months ago. "And what does this form disclose, Mr. Whitmore?" The room was perfectly still. Michael looked at the paper. He looked at David Park. Park gave him nothing, not a nod, not a signal, not a lifeline, because there was no lifeline to give. "It discloses," Michael said very carefully, "assets associated with Whitstone Holdings." "Assets," Rachel said, "not a concept that never moved forward. Assets. Reported by you under penalty of perjury to the federal government 14 months ago." She let that land. She gave it 4 full seconds of silence before she continued. "And in that same form in Section 3, what is your listed relationship to Whitstone Holdings?" Michael said nothing for a moment. "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Benton said very quietly, "please answer the question." "Beneficial owner," Michael said. The 2 words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Rachel turned to face the judge. "Your Honor, this document directly contradicts testimony given by the respondent before this court yesterday. The respondent claimed under oath that Whitstone Holdings held no assets and that he held no controlling interest. This federal form signed by the respondent himself establishes the opposite." David Park stood. "Your Honor, the timing and context of this document require examination. My client would like the opportunity to clarify." "Mr. Park," Judge Benton said, and something in his voice had changed, not louder, not angrier, but with a particular weight that made everyone in the room pay attention. "Your client has had considerable opportunity to clarify his testimony. He has chosen at multiple points in these proceedings to provide information to this court that appears to be directly contradicted by sworn federal documentation." He looked at Michael. "I have questions of my own." Michael turned to face the judge. The smile was gone. What had replaced it was something Emily could not quite name, not fear, not defeat, but something between the two. The expression of a man who has constructed an elaborate building and is now standing inside it while the walls begin to move. "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Benton said, setting down his pen and looking at Michael over his reading glasses, "you've sat in my courtroom for 2 days. You've looked me in the eye and told me that your marriage left nothing, no assets, no wealth, no security for your wife or your children. Is that correct? Your Honor, the financial picture is complex." "I didn't ask about complexity. I asked if that was your testimony." A pause. "That was my testimony." "Then I want to ask you something very directly." The judge folded his hands on the bench. "Are you telling this court that you were truthful to the United States government, that you accurately disclosed ownership of significant assets to federal tax authorities, but that you chose to present a completely different financial picture to this courtroom, to your own family?" The room was silent in the way that rooms are when everyone has stopped breathing at the same time. Michael Whitmore looked at Judge Benton, and for the first time in 3 days, he had no answer. Not a prepared one, not a rehearsed one, not a version of the truth shaped and polished into something that could pass for honesty. Nothing. David Park stepped in. "Your Honor, my client would like to take a brief recess to consult with counsel." "Denied," Judge Benton said. He was still looking at Michael. "Mr. Whitmore, you may step down. Ms. Morgan, call your next witness." Michael walked back to his seat. He did not look at Emily. He sat down. And the smile that had been there through every moment of those first 2 days, through every question and every objection and every carefully constructed answer, the smile was gone. Emily felt Rachel's hand briefly press her forearm under the table. She did not react. She kept her face still. She kept her breathing even. But inside, something that had been wound very tightly for a very long time was beginning slowly to release. The next witness Rachel called was a forensic accountant named Dr. Patricia Gould. She was 60 years old with short silver hair and a manner of speaking that was so precise and unhurried it made the complicated seem simple and the simple seem undeniable. She had been retained by Rachel's firm 3 months into the investigation after it became clear that the financial structure Michael had built around Whitstone Holdings was layered enough to require expert analysis. Dr. Gould took the stand and spent the next 45 minutes walking the court through what she called in her measured professional language a systematic pattern of asset concealment. She did not say fraud. She did not say theft. She did not use words that could be objected to or challenged for prejudicial framing. She simply described what the numbers showed, one transfer at a time, one account balance at a time, with the patient. Clarity of someone who knew that the facts presented plainly and in order were more devastating than any dramatic language could ever be. She showed that over a period of 14 months, assets totaling approximately $4.7 million had moved from entities controlled by Michael Whitmore into Whitstone Holdings. She showed that the operating costs of the Whitmore household, which Michael's financial disclosure listed as modest and debt-laden, did not match the lifestyle expenditures recorded across accounts linked to Whitstone Holdings. She showed the property in Nevada, a commercial building purchased 11 months ago, valued at $1.2 million, owned through a subsidiary of Whitstone Holdings. She showed the contract's 3 major construction projects currently active, generating revenue that had never appeared on any document Michael had submitted to this court. She showed the accounts. She showed the truth. David Park cross-examined her for nearly an hour. He challenged her methodology, her sourcing, her interpretation of the transfer agreements. She answered every challenge the same way she had answered Rachel's questions, precisely, patiently, without raising her voice or losing her composure, citing the specific line and page of every document she referenced. At the end of the cross-examination, Park sat down looking like a man who had been trying to build a wall out of sand. Judge Benton looked at the evidence in front of him. He took off his glasses. He rubbed his eyes briefly, the way people do when they are processing something that carries weight beyond the professional. Then he put his glasses back on. "We'll take a 30-minute recess," he said. "When we return, I'll hear closing arguments." The gavel came down. Emily stood up from her chair and realized her legs were shaking. Not from fear. She did not think it was fear anymore. She thought it might be something closer to the physical response of a body that has been holding tension for so long that when it begins to release, the muscles do not quite know what to do with themselves. Rachel gathered her papers. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said quietly, "He's exposed Emily. Whatever happens in closing the record is what it is." "Do you think the judge believes it?" Rachel looked at her. "I think Judge Benton wrote something on his notepad on the first morning of this trial and circled it twice. I think he has believed there was something wrong with this picture since before we proved it. And I think what he just heard from Patricia Gould confirmed everything he had already suspected." She paused. "Yes, I think he believes it." Emily nodded. She walked to the hallway. She stood near a window and looked at nothing in particular and breathed. A voice behind her said, "Emily." She turned. Michael was standing 10 feet away. He had sent his attorney in a different direction, apparently, and the hallway was quiet enough that it was just the two of them alone for the first time in months. He looked different without the courtroom around him. Smaller somehow, more human. The suit was still expensive and his posture was still controlled, but something in his face, in the set of his jaw, and the way his eyes were moving had changed. He said, "I want you to know something." She waited. "I didn't do this to hurt you," he said. "I want you to know that." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "Michael," she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected it to be, steadier than she would have believed possible 6 months ago, when she had sat at this man's kitchen table and watched her life change shape. "I don't think you thought about me at all. That's what I finally understand. It wasn't about hurting me. It wasn't about anything I did or didn't do. You didn't consider me. Not as a person. Not as someone whose future mattered." He said nothing. "I helped build that company," she said. "You know that. You've always known that. And you sat in that courtroom and told a judge that there was nothing left, nothing, because you thought I wouldn't be able to prove otherwise, because you thought I would just accept it." She stopped. "That's the part that I keep coming back to. You thought I would just accept it." Michael looked at the floor. "I'm not the person I was when I married you," Emily said. "I don't know when that changed, but it did." She turned and walked back toward the courtroom. She did not look back. She did not need to. David Park's closing argument lasted 22 minutes. It was well-structured, professionally delivered, and almost entirely undermined by the evidence that had already been entered into the record. He argued that the transfers to Whitstone Holdings represented legitimate business restructuring. He argued that the tax disclosure form was taken out of context. He argued that the forensic accountant's analysis made assumptions that a more charitable interpretation would not support. He was polished and precise and convincing in the way that very skilled attorneys can be even when they are working with almost nothing. Then Rachel stood up. She walked to the center of the room. She did not have any notes in her hand. "Your Honor," she said, "this case comes down to one question, not a complicated one, a simple one. Did Michael Whitmore tell the truth to this court?" She let that sit for a moment. "We have heard from Michael Whitmore under oath that his company's assets are gone. We have a federal tax disclosure form signed by Michael Whitmore establishing that those assets were transferred into a holding company of which he is the listed beneficial owner. We have forensic accounting establishing that those assets have continued to generate revenue. We have evidence of a property purchase made 11 months ago while this court was being told there was nothing left." She paused. "Michael Whitmore did not lose everything. Michael Whitmore moved everything. And then he came into this courtroom and told a judge under oath that there was nothing to find." She looked at the judge directly. "Emily Carter spent 18 years building this family. She made professional sacrifices that have been documented in this proceeding. She contributed to a business that now, according to its own tax records, holds assets valued at over $4 million. She deserves her share of what she helped create, and she deserves to have this court hold accountable the person who looked her in the eye and looked this court in the eye and lied." She sat down. Judge Benton was quiet for what felt like a very long time. He looked at his notepad. He looked at the documents. He looked at Michael Whitmore. Then he said, "I'm going to take this matter under consideration overnight. I will deliver my ruling at 9 a.m. tomorrow." He looked at both tables with the expression of a man who has made up his mind and is simply observing the formality of process. "Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning." The gavel came down. Emily sat completely still for a moment after the room began to move around her. She could hear Rachel gathering papers beside her. She could hear the low murmur of conversation starting up behind her. She could hear the sound of the courtroom returning to ordinary noise and motion. She looked at her hands flat on the table in front of her. She thought about what she had said to Michael in the hallway. "You thought I would just accept it." She thought about the 26-year-old woman who had turned down a $60,000 job offer because her husband had said, "I need you here." She thought about all the mornings and evenings and choices and sacrifices that had built a life that one person had then tried to take apart quietly, piece by piece, while that person smiled and said there was nothing left. She thought about Grace's drawing, the courthouse with the rainbow over it, and she thought tomorrow. Rachel put a hand on her shoulder. "Go home," Rachel said. "See your kids. Eat something. Tomorrow the judge is going to tell this court what the evidence already showed, and then this part is over." Emily stood up. She picked up her bag. She walked toward the door. She did not look at Michael. She did not need to look at Michael. She walked out into the corridor, and then out through the main doors and into the afternoon, and she stood there for a moment with the light falling around her, and she breathed. And she held the hard, clear thing in her chest, the thing that had been building since Rachel said, "We have it," and she let it be what it was. It was not revenge. It was not victory, not yet. It was the simple, solid, almost unbearable feeling of being believed, of having someone look at the evidence and say, "Yes, this happened. This is real. You were not wrong." She had spent months doubting her own memories, months wondering if the version of events Michael had presented so smoothly and so confidently was the one that was real, and whether the version in her own head was just the story a hurt person tells herself to make sense of something painful. The document had answered that question. His own signature had answered that question. And tomorrow, Judge Benton would answer it too. She walked to her car. She drove home to her children. And for the second night in a row, when she finally lay down in the dark, she did not stare at the ceiling for hours. She closed her eyes, and she slept. Emily was already awake at 5:47 when her alarm went off. She had been lying in the dark for about 20 minutes before that, not anxious, the way she had been anxious every other morning of the last 6 months, but awake in a different way. Alert. The way you are when you know something important is about to happen, and your body understands it even before your mind catches up. She got up. She made coffee. She stood in the kitchen in the quiet of the house while her children slept, and she held the mug with both hands and thought about nothing in particular, and everything at once. Daniel came downstairs at 6:15. He did not ask questions. He poured himself a glass of water, sat down across from her at the kitchen table, and said, "Today's the day, right?" "Today's the day," she said. "Are you scared?" She thought about that honestly. "No," she said. "I was scared for 6 months. I think I used it all up." Daniel looked at her for a moment with those steady eyes that had always reminded her so much of the man his father used to be, or perhaps the man his father had always been pretending to be. She was still working out the difference. "I think you're going to be okay, Mom," he said. "I've thought that for a while." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand once. Then she finished her coffee and went to get dressed. She chose the same jacket she had worn on the first day of trial. Not for superstition, but because it was the jacket she had been wearing the morning she walked into Rachel's office for the first time and decided she was going to fight. She wanted to walk into that courtroom today wearing the same thing she had been wearing when she made that decision. She wanted to feel the continuity of it, the through line from that first morning to this one. She was at the courthouse by 8:20. Rachel was already there, which Emily had expected. What she had not expected was the expression on Rachel's face when Emily walked through the conference room door, not the focused, contained expression Rachel wore during active proceedings, but something slightly more open, something that looked for a person as controlled as Rachel Morgan, almost like anticipation. "Anything new overnight?" Emily asked. Rachel was quiet for a half second, in a way that made Emily's pulse pick up. "David Park called me at 9 last night," Rachel said. Emily set down her bag. "Why?" "He said his client wanted to explore a settlement." The word landed between them, and Emily felt something complicated move through her. Not surprise exactly, but the particular sensation of a thing you have been bracing for, suddenly materializing. What kind of settlement? I wasn't specific. He said Michael was prepared to acknowledge the Whitstone Holdings assets and discuss an equitable division. Rachel paused. He also said Michael wanted the tax disclosure form kept out of any public filing going forward. Emily understood that immediately. He doesn't want it on the permanent record. "No," Rachel said, "he doesn't." "What did you tell Park?" "I told him we would hear any proposal through the court, that if Michael had something to offer Emily Carter, he could offer it with Judge Benton present." Rachel looked at her steadily. "I also told him that any settlement would need to fully account for every asset identified in Dr. Gould's analysis, not a negotiated fraction, all of it properly divided." Emily was quiet for a moment. And Park said he'd have to consult with his client. Rachel picked up her coffee. "Which means we're probably going to walk into that courtroom this morning and find out whether Michael Whitmore has finally decided that the cost of continuing to fight is higher than the cost of being honest." Emily thought about Michael standing in that hallway the previous afternoon. The smaller, more human version of him. The man who had said almost like he expected it to change something, "I didn't do this to hurt you." "What do you recommend?" Emily asked. "I recommend," Rachel said carefully, "that you let me talk first and you listen. And I recommend that you remember what we talked about on day one. This isn't about revenge. It's about what you are owed." Emily nodded. "Whatever Michael proposes," Rachel added. "Judge Benton has already seen the evidence. He's already read the tax disclosure form. Even if we settle, that record does not disappear from the judge's memory." She looked at Emily with something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. "Michael Whitmore cannot unring that bell." The courtroom at 9 a.m. felt different from the first 2 days. It was the same room, the same wood paneling, the same gallery seats, the same bench where Judge Benton would settle in a few minutes with his reading glasses and his notepad. But the air in it was different, tighter somehow, charged in the way that air gets before weather changes. Emily noticed that Michael was already seated when she came in. He was not looking at the door. He was looking at the table in front of him, and his posture for the first time across 3 days of watching him was not the posture of a man who owned every room he entered. His shoulders were slightly forward. His hands were folded on the table, but not in the easy, deliberate way of before. They were folded the way hands are when you need something to hold on to. David Park leaned over and said something to him. Michael nodded without looking up. Rachel took her seat beside Emily, organized 3 documents on the table in front of her, and then sat completely still. Emily looked at her hands in her lap. She breathed. Judge Benton entered at 9 o'clock exactly. The room stood. The room sat. The judge settled himself at the bench, put on his glasses, and looked at both tables with the expression Emily had spent 3 days learning to read. The expression of a man who had finished processing. "Before I deliver my ruling," the judge said, "I understand that Respondent's Counsel may have something to bring before the court." David Park stood. "Yes, Your Honor. My client wishes to address the court." A murmur through the gallery. Judge Benton looked over his glasses at the gallery, and the murmur stopped. Mr. Park. Your Honor, after reviewing the evidence presented in yesterday's proceedings, my client acknowledges that certain assets associated with Whitstone Holdings were not fully disclosed in his initial financial statement to this court. Park's voice was professional, measured, giving away nothing of what those words had cost his client to authorize. My client is prepared to provide a complete accounting of those assets and to engage in good faith negotiation toward an equitable settlement. The room was very still. Judge Benton did not react immediately. He looked at David Park for a long moment. Then he looked at Michael. Michael was looking at the table. "Mr. Whitmore," the judge said. Michael looked up. "I'd like to hear from you directly, not from your attorney." A pause. Park glanced at Michael. Michael sat slightly straighter. "Yes, Your Honor," Michael said. His voice was controlled, but the previous ease in it was gone. "I am prepared to acknowledge the assets." "The assets you testified 2 days ago did not exist," Judge Benton said. "Yes, Your Honor." The two words fell into the room like stones. Emily did not move. She kept her face still. She felt Rachel's posture remain perfectly composed beside her, and she matched it. "I appreciate that acknowledgement," the judge said with a tone that made clear he was not yet finished. "However, I want to be very clear about what this court has witnessed. This is not a situation where a party made an honest error in financial disclosure. The evidence before me includes a pattern of deliberate asset transfer conducted over more than a year, culminating in sworn testimony before this court that those assets did not exist. The document introduced by Ms. Morgan yesterday, the federal tax disclosure, establishes that the respondent was simultaneously reporting those assets to the United States government." He paused. He took off his glasses. "Mr. Whitmore, do you understand the distinction between a mistake and a deliberate misrepresentation?" Michael was very quiet. "I need a verbal response," Judge Benton said. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand the distinction." "Then I want you to understand something else very clearly. This court's willingness to consider a negotiated settlement does not in any way constitute a dismissal of what occurred in this proceeding. The record of this trial is permanent. My observations are part of that record. The misrepresentations made before this court are documented." The judge looked at Michael for a moment longer than seemed entirely procedural. "Proceed, Mr. Park." Park outlined the settlement framework that Michael was prepared to offer. As he spoke, Emily listened carefully, tracking each number against the figures she had memorized from Dr. Gould's testimony. Full disclosure and division of Whitstone Holdings assets based on forensic valuation. Emily's share of marital assets recalculated to include the transfers that had previously been hidden, the Nevada property, the active construction contracts, the cash reserves that had been sitting in Whitstone Holdings accounts, while Michael had told this court he had nothing. Rachel listened without changing expression. When Park finished, Judge Benton looked at Rachel. "Ms. Morgan, your response." Rachel stood. "Your Honor, we welcome the acknowledgement of assets. However, we have concerns about the valuation methodology being proposed by Respondents' Counsel. Dr. Gould's forensic analysis identified assets totaling approximately $4.7 million. The proposal presented by Mr. Park appears to use a different baseline." She set a single document on the judge's bench. "We believe the correct figure is the one established by independent forensic accounting, not a figure arrived at through the respondent's own revaluation of assets he previously denied having." Park rose. "Your Honor." "Mr. Park," Judge Benton said, holding up a hand, "I've read Dr. Gould's report. I found it thorough and credible. If your client wishes to propose an alternative valuation, he'll need to produce independent supporting documentation." He looked at the two tables. "I'm going to give both parties until 2 o'clock this afternoon to reach agreement on the asset valuation. If no agreement is reached, I will impose a ruling based on the evidence before me. And I will tell you now, Dr. Gould's numbers are persuasive." He set down his pen. "We'll recess until 2. The gavel came down. Emily turned to Rachel. She kept her voice very low. "He used a lower number on purpose." "Yes," Rachel said. "He shaved approximately $800,000 off the forensic figure. It's the Nevada property he's trying to reclassify its value." She was already writing. "He can't. The purchase documentation is part of the record, but he's trying to negotiate from a lower floor." "Can he get away with it?" "Not if I have anything to say about it," Rachel said. She stood up and began gathering her papers. "Get some coffee. I need 2 hours." Emily went to the hallway. She found a bench near a window and sat down and looked at the light coming through the glass and tried to remember how to be still. She had been a person who was good at stillness once. Before all of this, she had been a person who could sit quietly in the middle of a difficult situation and think clearly and not panic. The last 6 months had shaken that out of her, the constant uncertainty, the financial pressure, the particular specific cruelty of being gaslit by someone who knew exactly which of your memories to target and exactly how to make you question them. But sitting here now in the hallway of this courthouse on this particular morning, she could feel something beginning to return. Something she had not had language for until Daniel had looked at her across the kitchen table that morning and said, "I think you're going to be okay, Mom." She was going to be okay. Not because everything was fixed, not because the damage of the last 18 months had been undone, but because the worst of it, the not knowing, the doubting, the being told that what she had seen with her own eyes was not real, that part was over. The evidence had made it over. She was sitting with that thought when footsteps came down the hallway, and she looked up and found Daniel standing 20 feet away. She blinked. "What are you doing here?" He looked slightly sheepish. "Sophie drove me. We're in the parking lot. I wanted to see if you were okay." She almost said, "I told you not to come." She almost said you should be in school. She almost said any number of practical, responsible things. Instead, she said, "Come here." And he walked over and sat down beside her on the bench, the way he had when he was 9 years old. And she was the person in the world he most needed to be near. And she put her arm around him, even though he was 17 and too tall for it to be comfortable, and she held on for a moment. "I'm okay," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I can tell." They sat like that for a few minutes, which was long enough for Sophie to apparently lose patience in the parking lot because Emily's phone buzzed with a text that said, "Can I come in too? Or is it weird?" Emily laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in what felt like a very long time, and the sound surprised her slightly. She texted back, "Come in." Sophie appeared 2 minutes later, 14 years old, carrying a paper bag that turned out to contain 3 sandwiches and a bottle of water, because as Sophie explained with complete practicality, nobody fights well when they're hungry, Mom. They ate their sandwiches on the bench in the courthouse hallway. Emily and her 2 older children on the morning that was going to decide the shape of their lives going forward. Sophie asked too many questions and Daniel answered almost none of them, and Emily tried to explain in simple terms what was happening. "He's offering to settle," she said, "to admit what he hid and agree on how to divide it." "Why now?" Sophie asked. "Why didn't he do that at the beginning?" Emily thought about how to answer that. "Because he thought he didn't have to," she said finally. "He thought he had built something that couldn't be taken apart." Sophie considered this. "But Rachel took it apart." "Rachel took it apart." Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then she said with the particular directness that had always been her defining characteristic since she was about 4 years old, "Do you hate him, Mom?" The hallway was quiet. Emily looked at her daughter. She thought about the question honestly, the way she had always tried to think about honest questions, honestly, even when the honest answer was complicated. "No," she said. "I don't hate him. I think I used to love him. I think somewhere in there he used to be someone worth loving. And then..." She stopped. "And then he chose differently." Sophie nodded slowly. "Okay," she said in the tone of someone filing information away for later processing. At 12:30, Rachel appeared at the end of the hallway. She looked at Emily's children with a brief, warm expression that on anyone else might have been a smile, and then she looked at Emily. "I need you back in 5 minutes," she said. Emily stood up. She looked at Daniel and Sophie. "Go back to the car," she said. "Mom," Sophie started. "I'll call you the minute it's done," Emily said. "I promise." They went. Emily turned to Rachel. "What happened?" Rachel started walking back toward the conference room, and Emily fell into step beside her. Park came back at noon with a revised figure. He moved up from his original proposal. He added back most of the property valuation, but he's still trying to negotiate 2 contracts out of the forensic figure on the grounds that they predate the marriage. "Do they?" "No," Rachel said simply. "The paperwork doesn't support that. But here's what's interesting." She stopped just outside the conference room door and turned to face Emily. "He's negotiating now, which means Michael has made a calculation." "What calculation?" "That whatever he agrees to here is less costly than what Judge Benton will impose if we go back into that courtroom and the judge makes the ruling himself." She paused. And that calculation is correct, because if Benton rules, he's not just going to divide the assets. He's going to hold Michael responsible for the cost of every piece of investigative work and legal proceeding that Michael's deception made necessary. Emily understood. He's trying to limit the damage. He's trying to limit the damage, Rachel confirmed. And the question I need you to answer in the next 5 minutes is, this are you willing to settle, or do you want to let Judge Benton rule? Emily looked at her. What do you recommend? Rachel was quiet for a moment. If we settle, you get the assets properly valued, properly divided. It's guaranteed. It's over today. She paused. If we go back in and let the judge rule, he will hold Michael accountable for legal fees for the investigation costs, and there's a possibility based on the pattern of deception documented in the record that Benton refers the matter for contempt proceedings. Contempt. Lying to the court under oath, Rachel said quietly. Emily was still. She looked at the wall across from her. She thought about what she had told Sophie. He chose differently. She thought about what she had told Michael himself in the hallway the day before. You didn't consider me, not as a person, not as someone whose future mattered. She thought about the last 6 months, the doubt, the fear, the specific particular loneliness of being a person whose memories were being quietly dismantled by someone who smiled while they did it. She thought about what Rachel had said to her in their very first meeting. This isn't about revenge, it's about what you are owed. What does Emily Carter deserve? She asked. And she was not asking Rachel. She was asking herself out loud the way you sometimes need to do when the answer is something you already know but need to hear in your own voice. Rachel waited. She deserves everything Dr. Gould identified, Emily said. She deserves the legal fees paid, and she deserves— She stopped. She deserves to not be the person who let him off easy because it was faster. Rachel looked at her for a moment. Okay, she said. They went back into the courtroom at 2 o'clock without a settlement. Judge Benton looked at both tables. I understand negotiations were not successful. That's correct, Your Honor, Rachel said. The judge nodded once. He picked up his notepad. He looked at it for a moment, then he set it down. I've reviewed the evidence in this matter extensively, he said. The forensic accounting testimony presented by Dr. Patricia Gould I find to be credible, thorough, and supported by documentary evidence that this court has examined directly. The respondent's own sworn federal disclosure confirms the asset picture she described. He looked at Michael. Mr. Whitmore, this court finds that you engaged in a deliberate and sustained effort to conceal marital assets from your spouse and from these proceedings. The transfers to Whitstone Holdings were not administrative reorganizations as you characterize them. They were a calculated attempt to remove assets from the marital estate in anticipation of divorce proceedings. The room was absolutely still. This court rules that the full asset base identified in Dr. Gould's forensic analysis, $4.7 million in holdings. Property contracts and accounts shall be treated as marital property, subject to equitable distribution. Emily's heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. Emily Carter's share of marital assets shall be calculated accordingly, including her contribution both as a domestic partner and as a documented operational contributor to the business that generated those assets. He paused. Furthermore, the respondent shall bear full responsibility for the petitioner's legal costs in this proceeding, including investigative fees, expert witness fees, and attorney fees, which this court finds were made necessary by the respondent's deliberate misrepresentation. David Park had his pen moving. Michael was sitting completely still. I am additionally directing that the complete record of these proceedings, including the respondent's initial testimony and the federal disclosure document entered as Exhibit 14, be preserved and referred to the appropriate authorities for review of potential contempt of court. The judge's voice was level, entirely professional, not cruel, simply clear. That determination is not within my jurisdiction to make, but the referral is within my responsibility. The gavel came down, and the room exhaled. Emily sat at the table and she looked at her hands and she did not cry. She had thought she would cry. She had imagined this moment for months, and in her imagination she had always been crying at the end of it. But she was not crying. She was sitting with a stillness that did not feel like numbness. It felt like the opposite of numbness, like every nerve in her body was awake and present and exactly where it needed to be. Rachel put a hand on her arm. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Across the room, Michael Whitmore stood up slowly from his chair. He spoke briefly to David Park, something very quiet, and Park nodded without expression. Then Michael picked up the single notepad he had brought to this trial, and he straightened his jacket, and he walked toward the courtroom door. He passed within 10 feet of where Emily was sitting. He stopped. For just a moment, one moment, he looked at her. His face was not angry. It was not the face of a man building toward another argument or preparing another explanation. It was something much simpler than that and much harder to look at. It was the face of a man who had finally run out of story. He did not say anything. He turned and walked out. Emily watched the door close behind him. She breathed. She thought 18 years. She thought 3 children. She thought about this woman who had sat in Rachel Morgan's office 6 months ago, looking like someone who had not slept in 3 weeks. Not sure she could do this, not sure she had whatever it was going to take. She thought about that woman, and she felt something move through her that was enormous and quiet at the same time, an enormous quiet feeling like a tide going out after a very long storm. She picked up her bag. She took out her phone. She texted Sophie Dunn, "Coming out now." Sophie's response came back in 4 seconds flat. "We're coming in." Emily laughed again. Same laugh as before, the surprised one, the one that had been sitting somewhere inside her waiting for the right moment. She stood up from the table and turned toward the door. Rachel was watching her. "Thank you," Emily said. Rachel nodded once, and in that nod was everything. The 4 months of work, the 11:47 email, the specific genius of placing the tax disclosure form in the exact right moment for it to do the most damage to the story Michael had built. All of it in one nod. "Go see your kids," Rachel said. Emily went. She pushed through the courtroom door into the corridor, and Sophie was already running toward her from the far end. 17 feet covered in about 4 seconds, and Emily caught her, and Daniel was right behind her, walking fast, and Emily held both of them in the middle of the courthouse hallway, while the ordinary noise of the building moved around them. Sophie said something into her shoulder that Emily could not quite make out. "What?" Emily said. Sophie pulled back slightly. Her eyes were wet. "I said I knew it." Emily looked at her. "You knew what?" "I knew you were going to win." Emily looked at her daughter, at this fierce, impatient, direct 14-year-old who had sat in the parking lot of a federal courthouse eating sandwiches because she could not stay away, who had asked, "Do you hate him?" with the honesty of someone who needed a real answer, and she pulled her back in and held her again. "Yeah," she said quietly, "me too." She did not know exactly when she had started to know that, but she thought it might have been the moment she stopped accepting the story someone else was telling about who she was and started trusting the one she knew herself. That was the moment. That was when it had started to turn. The drive home from the courthouse that afternoon was the quietest Emily could remember in years. Not the uncomfortable quiet of a house where 2 people have stopped talking to each other. Not the anxious quiet of the last 6 months, the kind that pressed down on everything and made ordinary sounds feel too loud. This was a different kind of quiet, entirely the kind that comes after something large has finally finished moving, when the air settles back into the space it was supposed to occupy all along. Sophie had fallen asleep in the back seat within 10 minutes. The emotional output of the morning had apparently caught up with her in the way it catches up with teenagers suddenly and completely, like a switch thrown. Daniel drove. He kept both hands on the wheel and did not fill the silence with words, which was one of the things Emily had always loved about him. She watched the road and thought about nothing, or tried to. The way you try to rest a muscle that has been tensed for so long, it has forgotten how to release. Her phone had been buzzing since they left the courthouse. She had not looked at it yet. She knew it would be people who had heard friends who had watched from a distance, a sister in Phoenix who had been calling twice a week since the filing Rachel's paralegal, with next steps on the financial transfer process. All of it real, all of it important, all of it something she could handle in an hour. Right now she just needed the road and the quiet and the sound of Daniel breathing steadily beside her. At some point he said without preamble, "What happens to Dad now?" She thought about that carefully. The judge referred the contempt question. That means another set of people look at what happened in that courtroom and decide if there are additional consequences. "Could he go to jail?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "That's not something I control." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Do you want him to—" She looked at the road ahead. "I want my children to have a father," she said. "Whatever that looks like from here." Daniel nodded slowly. He did not push further, which told her he had been sitting with versions of that question for a while already and had his own partial answers. They pulled into the driveway at 3:42. Sophie woke up the moment the car stopped with the instant alertness of someone who had not been asleep deeply enough to be truly gone. She climbed out without saying much, went inside, and disappeared upstairs. Daniel helped carry Emily's bag from the back seat and set it inside the front door. Then he said, "I'm going to call Matt. Is that okay?" "Of course," Emily said. "Go." She stood alone in the front hallway of the house that she had fought to keep and that the court had now confirmed would remain hers and the children's at least, and she looked at the familiar shape of it and felt the strange vertigo of a place remaining physically the same while everything within it has completely changed. She set her keys on the hook by the door. She took off her jacket. She went to the kitchen and she put the kettle on, and she finally picked up her phone. 14 text messages, 3 missed calls, 1 voicemail from her sister Karen that was 3 minutes and 20 seconds long, which meant Karen had felt strongly about something, and 1 text at the very bottom of the list from a number she did not immediately recognize. She almost skipped it. Then she looked at the first few words visible in the preview, and her hand went still. She opened it. "Emily, this is Patricia Gould. I wanted you to know that in 30 years of forensic accounting, I have rarely seen someone fight as clearly or as honestly as you did in that courtroom. What you did took real courage. I hope you know that." Emily read it twice. Then she set the phone down on the counter and stood with her hands flat against the kitchen surface and breathed through the feeling that came up. Not grief this time, not relief, but something rawer than either. The feeling of being seen by a stranger who had no particular reason to see you and chose to anyway. The kettle whistled. She made her tea. She called Karen back. Karen answered on the first ring, which she had been doing for the last 6 months, every time Emily called, no matter the hour. "Tell me everything," Karen said. And Emily did. She talked for 40 minutes, something she had not done. Talked, really talked, not performed. Being okay, but actually talked in longer than she could remember. She told Karen about the hallway conversation with Michael. She told her about Sophie's sandwiches and Daniel's steady driving and the sound the gavel made when Judge Benton brought it down for the final time. She told her about Patricia Gould's text. She told her about sitting in the car watching the road and feeling the quiet settling around her, like something returning to its natural state. Karen cried twice and apologized for it both times, and Emily told her to stop apologizing. At the end, Karen said, "What do you need right now, not next week, right now?" Emily thought about it. "I need to figure out who I am without this," she said. "Without the fight. Without the thing I've been fighting toward for 6 months. I need to remember what I was before I was someone in the middle of a crisis." "Do you remember?" "Some of it," Emily said. "I'm going to have to rebuild the rest." "You're good at building things," Karen said. Emily smiled. "Yeah," she said, "I am." She hung up and sat with her tea and let the afternoon happen around her, the sounds of the house, Daniel's voice somewhere upstairs, the particular quality of late afternoon light she had always liked without ever saying so out loud. She sat with all of it and did not rush any of it and did not think about what came next. Just for that one afternoon, she let it be enough. The call from Rachel came the following morning at 8:55. Emily was in the kitchen making breakfast for Grace, who had school and was running late, and was complaining about her shoe, one of which had apparently disappeared overnight in a way that defied physical explanation. She put her phone between her ear and her shoulder and kept making eggs. "The financial transfer documentation is being prepared," Rachel said without preamble. "The court-appointed administrator will begin the asset valuation process next week. You'll need to provide bank account information and decide how you want the property interest structured, whether you want a buyout of the Nevada property or a percentage interest." "Buyout," Emily said immediately. "I don't want anything with his name still on it." "That was my recommendation," Rachel said. "One more thing." A pause. "David Park called this morning." Emily set down the spatula. "Again. Michael wants to request a meeting, not through the court. He wants to meet with you directly without attorneys." Silence. "No," Emily said. That was quick. "I've said everything I need to say to him. I said it in the hallway. Whatever he needs to hear now, he needs to find a way to say it to himself." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "All right, I'll tell Park." "Rachel." Emily picked the spatula back up. "Thank you. I don't know if I said it the right way yesterday, but I mean it. What you did, the way you built that case, I will never forget it." "You gave me something real to work with," Rachel said. "You knew something was wrong when everyone was telling you to accept his version. That's not nothing, Emily. That's actually everything." Emily found Grace's shoe behind the couch cushion, which made no sense, but was accepted by both of them without further investigation, and got her to school 4 minutes before the bell. Then she went home and sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen. She wrote at the top of the page, "What comes next?" She stared at it for a while. Then she crossed out "What comes next" and wrote instead, "What I want." That was harder. It had been so long since that had been a question she was permitted to ask herself that the act of writing it down felt almost transgressive, like accessing a room she had been keeping locked for years without quite realizing it. She thought about the marketing job she had turned down at 26. The firm that had offered it no longer existed in the same form. The industry had shifted. The landscape was completely different. But the skills she had brought to that offer had not disappeared. They had been applied differently to something else for 18 years. She had managed budgets and vendor relationships and client communications and operational logistics for a company that now, per court documentation, held assets of over $4 million. She had been running a business. She had simply not been credited for it. She wrote "business of my own." She looked at it. She wrote "marketing consulting," or "operations," or both. She looked at that. Then she wrote, "Call Lisa Chen." Lisa Chen had been Emily's closest friend in college. They had taken 3 business courses together and had always said in the vague way of people who mean it, but cannot yet see how that they would work together someday. Lisa now ran a small consulting firm in Atlanta. They had kept in imperfect but genuine contact over the years, the kind of friendship that can go 3 months without a call and pick up exactly where it left off. Emily picked up her phone. Lisa answered on the 3rd ring with, "Emily Carter. I was literally thinking about you this week." "That's either a coincidence or you saw something on the news," Emily said. "Neither," Lisa said. "I had a dream where you and I were running a company together and we were both extremely good at it. What's happening with you?" Emily laughed, the surprised laugh again. She was finding more occasions for it lately. "I have a lot to tell you," she said. The contempt referral moved faster than anyone had expected. 12 days after Judge Benton's ruling, Emily received a call from Rachel with information she had been holding since the day before, wanting to confirm before sharing. "The U.S. Attorney's Office has opened a preliminary inquiry," Rachel said. "Michael's attorneys have been notified." Emily was standing in the backyard. She had been pulling weeds from the garden, something she had not done in over a year because there had always been something more urgent. What does that mean in practical terms? It means the federal disclosure form, the one Michael signed, reporting himself as beneficial owner of Whitstone Holdings, is now being examined in the context of what he testified to in divorce court. Specifically, whether what he told the court constitutes perjury in addition to contempt. Emily sat down on the low stone wall at the edge of the garden. "Perjury. Lying under oath is a federal offense," Rachel said carefully. "I'm not telling you what the outcome will be. I don't know. These inquiries can go many directions. But I am telling you that the document you helped us find, the document that Michael signed, believing it would never surface in the one context where it could destroy him, that document is now the center of a federal inquiry." Emily looked at the garden. She thought about Michael's face in the hallway of the courthouse, that smaller, more human face, the one that had said, "I didn't do this to hurt you," as if the distinction mattered. She thought about his face when he left the courtroom, the face of a man who had run out of story. He really thought he had thought of everything, she said. It was not a question. "Most of them do," Rachel said quietly. "Do you think he knew when he signed that tax form that it could come back this way?" Rachel was quiet for a moment. "I think he believed that the divorce court and the federal tax system were 2 separate worlds that would never intersect. I think he built his entire plan around that assumption." She paused. "He was wrong." Emily was quiet. She looked at the weeds she had been pulling piled to one side and at the patch of ground underneath that was cleaner now, if not yet exactly right. "Thank you for telling me," she said. She hung up. She sat on the stone wall for a while. She was not happy about the inquiry the way she might have expected to be. She was not punching the air or feeling vindicated in some triumphant way. What she felt was quieter than that. Something more like the feeling of watching a process that was simply running its course, the natural consequence of choices made moving through the world with the slow inevitability of things that cannot be undone. Michael had built his plan on the belief that he could control information, that he could decide what people knew and what they did not know, what existed on paper and what did not, what version of reality was accepted as real. He had practiced that control for years. Emily understood now, not just in the business, not just in the months before the divorce, but within their marriage itself. The selective truths, the managed conversations, the smile that said, "I already know the outcome of this." He had built an entire architecture of control, and it had not held. Not because Rachel Morgan was brilliant though she was, not because the forensic accounting was comprehensive though it was. It had not held because the one thing Michael had not been able to control was a piece of paper that the law required him to file. A routine bureaucratic document that existed in a filing system that did not belong to him. He had been meticulous about everything he could touch. He had forgotten that some things exist precisely because they cannot be touched. The truth, Emily thought, sitting on the stone wall in her garden, does not disappear. It waits, and the longer it waits, the more quietly certain it becomes. She picked up the pile of weeds and carried them to the compost bin at the edge of the yard. Then she went inside and called Lisa Chen back to continue a conversation that had gone very well and was beginning to look like something real. 3 weeks after the ruling, Daniel came home from school and found Emily at the kitchen table with 2 laptops open, a legal pad covered in notes, and the particular expression he associated with his mother, being genuinely absorbed in something, not stressed, not managing, but actually engaged. He stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. "You look different," he said. She looked up. "Different how?" "Like you did when I was little, before everything got—" He stopped. He was not always good at finishing those kinds of sentences. "You just look like yourself again." She looked at him for a moment. The 17-year-old who had driven her to the courthouse without asking questions and put his hand over hers at the kitchen table and said, "You've got this." The son who carried his father's jaw and his grandmother's eyes, and something uniquely his own in the way he moved through the world, a steadiness that had nothing to do with either parent and everything to do with who he was choosing to become. "I'm starting a consulting business," she said. "With Lisa. You remember Lisa? The one from Atlanta. You talk to her like every week now. We're going to work together. Operations and marketing strategy for small and mid-sized companies." She paused. "Companies that need someone who actually understands how to keep a business running when everything is trying to fall apart." Daniel looked at her. "So basically what you've been doing for the last 18 years. Emily stared at him. Then she laughed, genuinely fully laughed. "Yes," she said, "basically exactly that." He grinned a rare, complete grin that made him look 12 years old for a moment and dropped his backpack by the door and came in and looked over her shoulder at the laptops. "What are you calling it?" he asked. "We're deciding between 2 names," she said. "I'll tell you when we've agreed." He nodded. He went to the refrigerator, found something, went upstairs. At the bottom of the stairs he paused and turned back. "Mom," he said. "Yeah. He really thought you couldn't do it, didn't he?" It was not quite a question. Emily looked at her son. She thought about the answer for exactly as long as it took to know it was true. "Yes," she said, "he did." Daniel nodded slowly with an expression that was difficult to read precisely, but was somewhere between sadness and a very specific, very quiet kind of pride. "Good thing you knew better," he said. He went upstairs. Emily sat with that for a moment. Then she turned back to her laptops. The text started on a Friday evening 4 weeks after the ruling. Emily was putting Grace to bed, the elaborate negotiated process that involved 2 stories and 1 additional non-negotiable glass of water, and a conversation about whether goldfish have feelings, which Grace had apparently been thinking about seriously for several days, when her phone lit up on the nightstand with a number she did not recognize. She finished the story. She answered the goldfish question as honestly as she could. She turned off the light. Then she went to the hallway and looked at the message. "Emily, it's James Whitmore. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need to tell you something." James Whitmore was Michael's younger brother. Emily had always liked James, a quieter, more self-aware version of his older brother, someone who had never fully agreed with how Michael operated, but had also for years said nothing. They had seen each other at family events for 18 years and maintained a warmth that was genuine without being particularly deep. She had not heard from him since before the divorce filing. She stood in the hallway and read the message twice. Then she typed back, "What is it, James?" 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "Michael is not doing well. I'm not asking you to do anything about that. I just thought you should know because of the kids. He's been staying with me and it's been hard to watch." Emily leaned against the hallway wall. She thought about many things at once. She thought about Daniel's question, could he go to jail? She thought about Sophie's, do you hate him? She thought about the man she had loved at 26, and the man who had sat in that courtroom and smiled, and the man in the hallway who had run out of story. She typed, "Thank you for telling me, James." He responded, "He's going to have to figure out who he is now. I think maybe he never really did that. Figure out who he was. He always just figured out what he needed to be to get what he wanted." A pause. Another message, "I'm sorry. For what it's worth coming from me, I'm sorry." Emily looked at that message for a long time. She typed, "I know it's not your fault, James. Take care of yourself." She put her phone in her pocket and went downstairs. She sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the house, Grace asleep upstairs, Sophie doing homework somewhere in the back of the house, Daniel out with friends until 9, and she sat with James's message and what it had done to her. She had expected on some level in the part of her that had spent 6 months fighting and was still learning how to stop. She had expected that knowing Michael was struggling would feel like something. Satisfaction or relief or the particular complicated emotion of watching someone receive a consequence they earned. It did not feel like any of those things. It felt like sorrow, clean and simple and not about her at all. Sorrow for a person who had constructed so much around having what he wanted that he had never done the more important work of becoming someone who could live with himself without it. James had said it more simply than she could have. He always just figured out what he needed to be to get what he wanted. She had lived inside that for 18 years without fully naming it. She named it now, sitting at the kitchen table. She named it and she let it go. Not for Michael, not because he deserved her forgiveness, not because what he had done was excusable or small or something she owed him the grace of overlooking. She let it go because carrying it was something she had already spent 6 months doing, and she was done. She was done. She picked up her legal pad. She flipped to a clean page. At the top, she wrote the name she and Lisa had finally agreed on that morning in a phone call that had run an hour and a half and ended with both of them laughing about something neither of them could adequately explain to anyone else. Carter and Chen Advisory Group. She wrote it. She looked at it. She wrote under it, launch date 90 days. Then she wrote a list of the first 5 clients she intended to call. She had been thinking about those 5 names for 2 weeks. They were all people she had met through the construction business over the years, business owners who had worked with Whitmore construction people. She had personally managed relationships with people who had asked her questions. She had always deferred. "Do you consult privately, Emily? Do you take on independent work?" She had always said no. The timing never worked. The family needed her here. The timing worked now. She wrote all 5 names in a clear, unhurried hand. Then she put down the pen and she sat back in her chair, and she looked at what she had written. For the first time in 18 years, not the first time in 6 months, not the first time since the filing, but the first time in 18 years, what Emily Carter saw when she looked at the page in front of her was not someone else's future. It was hers, entirely uncomplicatedly, undeniably hers. She sat with that. She let it be real. She did not rush it or qualify it or immediately fill it with logistics and next steps and practical concerns. She just let herself feel it, this plain, enormous, quietly revolutionary thing. She was free, not because a judge had ruled it, not because a document had proved it, because she had looked at the thing she was carrying and she had put it down. And it turned out the thing she had always been, without the weight of it. The person she had been under, everything she had given away, and everything that had been taken, that person was still there, intact, waiting, ready. Grace called from upstairs. "Mom, the goldfish thing is still bothering me." Emily closed the legal pad. "Coming, baby?" she called back. She stood up from the table. She went upstairs. The 90 days passed faster than Emily had expected. Not because they were easy. They were not easy. Starting a business while simultaneously navigating the financial transfer process from the divorce settlement, managing 3 children at different stages of needing different things, and trying to sleep more than 5 hours a night, none of that was easy. But there is a particular quality to hard work that you have chosen, as opposed to hard work that has been imposed on you, and Emily was learning the difference in her bones. She felt it every morning when she sat down at the kitchen table with her coffee and her legal pad and her 2 laptops and began working before the house woke up. She felt it in the conversations with Lisa, which happened 3 times a week now, and had a momentum and an energy that was entirely different from anything Emily had experienced in years. She felt it in the calls to those first 5 clients, all 5 of whom had said yes, 2 of them immediately, 1 of them within the same week, the other 2 after short conversations that left Emily with the unmistakable sensation of being in exactly the right place. Carter & Chen Advisory Group launched on a Tuesday in early spring with a website that Lisa had designed over a long weekend, a client list of 7, and a working agreement that Emily and Lisa had negotiated over 3 phone calls and 1 very long dinner in Atlanta where they had talked about business for 40 minutes and then talked about everything else for 4 hours. Emily called Rachel the morning of the launch. Rachel picked up between meetings. "Tell me you're doing something that actually matters today." "I launched the company," Emily said. A pause. Carter & Chen. Carter & Chen. "How does it feel?" Emily looked at the website on her laptop. Her name, her work, her future structured around her choices. "It feels like something that should have happened 10 years ago," she said, "and also exactly like something that could only happen now." Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm proud of you, Emily. You told me once this wasn't about revenge." "I did." "You were right," Emily said. "It was never about revenge. It was about getting back to a point where I could do something like this." She paused. "That's what I needed. That's what the whole fight was for." She heard Rachel smile through the phone. It was a rare sound. "Go work," Rachel said. "You have clients." Emily laughed and hung up. She opened the first email of the day from a new client, a woman named Sandra Park, who ran a mid-size catering company in Virginia and had been referred by one of the original 5, and she began to read. She was fully absorbed within 4 minutes. That was how the next chapter of her life began, not with fanfare, not with a dramatic turning point that announced itself as significant, just with a woman at a kitchen table reading an email doing the work she was built for. It was enough. It was more than enough. The call Emily had not been prepared for came 6 weeks after the launch on a Thursday afternoon when Grace was at school and Sophie was at a friend's house and Daniel was at soccer practice, and the house was quiet in the specific way it is when you are used to managing noise, and suddenly there is none. Emily was on a call with a client in Charlotte when her phone buzzed with a second incoming call. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. She let it go to voicemail and finished the Charlotte call. Then she listened to the message. It was a woman's voice, professional measured. She identified herself as an investigator with the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District. She said, "Ms. Carter, we'd like to speak with you at your earliest convenience regarding the matter of United States versus Michael T. Whitmore. You are not a subject of this inquiry. We believe you may have information relevant to our investigation. Please call at your earliest convenience." Emily sat very still for a moment. Then she called Rachel. Rachel answered immediately. "I just got the same call," she said. "What does this mean?" "It means they've moved past preliminary inquiry. They've opened a formal investigation." Rachel's voice was careful. "Emily, I want to be very clear about something. This is not the divorce case anymore. This is a federal proceeding. Whatever happened in Judge Benton's courtroom is now the foundation of something much larger." "They want to talk to me." "Yes." "What do I tell them?" "The truth," Rachel said. "Exactly what you told the divorce court, which is what you know and what you observed and what the evidence showed." A pause. "Emily, you didn't do anything wrong. You fought for what was fair. The fact that fighting for it exposed something larger that's not your fault. That's just the truth doing what the truth does when you let it." Emily looked at the window. She thought about what Rachel had told her 6 months ago in the first meeting they ever had. Liars make mistakes. Small ones. The kind that don't matter until suddenly they matter very much. Michael's mistake had been a federal tax form, a routine piece of paper, a signature on a document that existed because the law required it to exist in a system that did not belong to him and could not be managed or controlled or smiled at. "Okay," Emily said. "I'll call them back." She made the call. The meeting with the federal investigator was scheduled for the following week. Emily went with her own attorney. Rachel had connected her with a colleague who handled federal matters, and she answered every question they asked with the same honesty she had brought to every other part of this process. The investigator, a composed woman in her early 40s, named Special Agent Torres, asked about Michael's financial behavior during the marriage. About the moment Emily had first suspected something was wrong, about the specific sequence of events that had led her to Rachel Morgan and the investigative process that had uncovered Whitstone Holdings. Emily answered for 2 hours. Agent Torres thanked her at the end and told her they would be in touch if they needed anything further. Emily went home, sat down at the kitchen table, and did not think about it anymore. That was the part that surprised her most, her own capacity to put it down. 6 months ago, she would have gone over every word of that meeting 40 times, replaying it, questioning herself, wondering if she had said the right thing or the wrong thing, or whether the version of events she understood to be true would hold up under external scrutiny. She would have lain awake with it for a week. Now she made herself a cup of tea and called Lisa about a new client prospect and did not think about Michael Whitmore again until Sophie brought him up at dinner that evening. "I heard Dad might be in real trouble," Sophie said in the direct way she had, that still sometimes caught Emily without a response ready. Emily looked at her daughter across the table. Grace was drawing something on the back of a school paper, apparently oblivious. Daniel was watching Emily. "There's a federal investigation," Emily said. "I don't know what that will result in. I don't control that part." "Did you help start it?" Sophie asked. "I answered their questions honestly, same as I did in divorce court." Emily set down her fork. "Sophie, what happened in that courtroom that wasn't something I did to your father? It was something your father did, and the investigation is a consequence of that, not of me." Sophie was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "I just wanted to make sure you know that I know, that we know." She glanced at Daniel. Daniel nodded once. "We're not mad at you, Mom. I just want to make sure you're not carrying that." Emily looked at her daughter. This 14-year-old who had asked, "Do you hate him?" with the directness of someone who needed a real answer, who had brought sandwiches to the parking lot of a federal courthouse, who was now apparently checking to make sure her mother was not secretly burdened by guilt she did not deserve. "I'm not carrying it," Emily said. "Okay," Sophie said, and picked up her fork with the efficiency of someone who had raised the subject, received a satisfactory answer, and was ready to move on. Grace looked up from her drawing. "What's a federal investigation? Big question for a school night," Daniel said smoothly. "Eat your broccoli." Grace looked at the broccoli. "I don't really like broccoli." "Nobody does," Daniel said. "Eat it anyway." Grace ate it. Emily looked at her 3 children around the table and felt something so enormous and ordinary at the same time that she had no name for it. It was not a dramatic feeling. It was not the feeling of a turning point. It was the feeling of Tuesday night dinner of 3 people who were going to be okay, of a table that had gotten smaller in some ways and larger in others, of a life that was continuing, not despite everything that had happened, but through it and past it and into something genuinely new. The federal indictment came 11 weeks later. Emily found out through Rachel, who called at 9 in the morning on a Wednesday, with the contained, careful energy of someone delivering information that is significant without being celebratory. "Michael has been indicted on 2 counts of perjury and 1 count of fraudulent concealment of assets," Rachel said. "The U.S. Attorney's Office issued the indictment this morning." Emily sat down. She had been standing at the counter making coffee, and she sat down at the kitchen table because it seemed like the kind of news you received sitting down. "Perjury," she said. 2 counts. The testimony he gave in divorce court, the direct contradiction of the federal disclosure, that's count 1. There's a 2nd count related to documentation he submitted to a business partner during the asset transfer period. Rachel paused. "Emily, I want to say something clearly. You did not cause this. The law caused this. Michael caused this. You simply told the truth and gave the truth somewhere to go." Emily was quiet. "How do you feel?" Rachel asked. It was such a simple question that it almost undid her. "I don't know yet," Emily said honestly. "I thought I would feel more, or less. I'm not sure which." "That's normal," Rachel said. "You've been carrying this for almost a year. When the big things finally land, sometimes the feeling takes a while to arrive." Emily looked at her coffee cup. She thought about Michael's face in the hallway of the courthouse, the face he had worn when he had run out of story. She thought about James's text. He always just figured out what he needed to be to get what he wanted. "Is he going to prison?" she asked. "That depends on how he pleads and what the prosecution builds. Perjury carries significant penalties. The asset concealment adds to that." A pause. "His attorneys will negotiate. Most of these cases result in a plea agreement rather than a trial. But Emily, the consequences are real. Whatever he negotiates down to this is permanent. This goes on his record. This follows him." Emily nodded slowly. Then she realized Rachel could not see her and said, "Okay." "Are you okay?" "Yes," Emily said. And she was, not in the uncomplicated way of someone who has gotten everything they wanted. In the more complicated and more real way of someone who has finished something that needed to be finished and is standing in the aftermath, which is always quieter than you expect and always exactly what it is. She called Daniel first. He was between classes at the community college he had started attending in September, pursuing an engineering program that he had decided on with the same quiet deliberateness he brought to everything. He answered on the second ring. "They indicted him," Emily said. Silence for a moment. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay." Another pause. "Okay," he said. He sounded like he was processing. "Do the girls know?" "Not yet. I wanted to tell you first." "I'll be home by 3, he said. "We can tell Sophie together if you want. Grace, I don't know if Grace needs to know all of it yet." "No," Emily agreed. "Not yet." "Mom," his voice was quiet. "You did the right thing. Every step. I just want you to know that I know that." She held the phone against her ear and breathed through whatever was happening in her chest. "Thank you, Daniel." "See you at 3, he said. She called Lisa next, which was different from calling Daniel. Lisa responded with the particular energy of a person who had been following this story with enormous investment and did not believe in suppressing strong reactions. "Oh my God," Lisa said before Emily had finished the sentence. "Oh my God, Emily." "I know. Do you want to celebrate? Should we celebrate? Is that appropriate?" "I feel like that's appropriate. I'm going to open a bottle of wine." "It's 9:30 in the morning, Lisa." "I'll open it for later, symbolically." Emily laughed. The surprised laugh, still finding new occasions for it. "I don't want to celebrate exactly," she said. "It's more like it's done. That part is done." "The whole thing is done," Lisa said firmly. "You fought a war for a year, Emily, and you won, and now the part where the enemy faces consequences is happening, and that is the end. That is the actual end." Emily considered this framing. It was not quite how she would have described it herself, but there was something in Lisa's complete certainty that she needed to hear. "Yeah," she said. "Okay, yeah." "Tonight," Lisa said, "you are going to do something that is entirely, completely, 100% for yourself. Not for the kids, not for the business, not for the next step or the next thing. For you. What do you want to do?" Emily thought about it. "I want to take a bath and read a novel and eat that cheese I've been saving in the back of the refrigerator," she said. A pause. "That," Lisa said, "is the most Emily Carter answer in the world, and I love it. Do exactly that." That evening after the conversations with Sophie that had gone better than expected. Sophie had been quiet, then said, "Okay," then asked if she could call her best friend, and after Grace had been settled with a story about a family of talking frogs that had nothing to do with anything happening in the real world, Emily did exactly what she had told Lisa she was going to do. She ran a bath. She found the novel she had bought 8 months ago and never opened. She got the cheese from the back of the refrigerator, which was a sharp-aged cheddar that she had been rationing mentally for an occasion that qualified as significant enough. She decided this qualified. She sat in the bath and she read and she ate cheese, and she did not think about Michael Whitmore or Whitstone Holdings or federal indictments or asset transfer documentation. She thought about the novel, which was absorbing and very good. She thought about a passage she had read and immediately wanted to read again. She thought about nothing for stretches at a time, which was its own luxury, the ability to be in your own mind without the weight of urgency pressing on every thought. She stayed in the bath until the water cooled. Then she got out and got into bed and read for another 40 minutes and turned off the light at 10:15, which was early for her these days. In the dark and the quiet of the house, she lay on her back and looked at the ceiling. She thought 1 year ago I did not know any of this was coming. 1 year ago, she had been a woman in a marriage that she had understood to be real, managing a household and a business operation, and 3 children with the particular efficiency of someone who has been doing too many things for too long to stop and ask whether any of them are working. 1 year ago, she had loved a man she did not entirely know. 1 year ago, she had been carrying weight she had not yet identified as weight, because she had been carrying it for so long it felt like part of her body. 1 year ago, she thought about everything the last year had cost her. The fear, the months of doubt, the specific cruelty of being told by someone who knew her deeply that the things she knew to be true were not true. The loneliness of fighting something that most people around her could not fully see. The morning she had woken up at 5 a.m. with her heart already pounding. The evening she had sat at the kitchen table trying to explain to her children in terms they could bear what was happening to their family. It had cost her things she could not get back, but it had given her things she had not expected to receive. It had given her Rachel Morgan, who had shown her what a woman fighting clearly and carefully for something real looked like. It had given her Daniel's quiet steadiness, which she had always known was there, but had not known how much she needed until the moment she needed it. It had given her Sophie's sandwiches and Grace's courthouse drawing with the rainbow over it. It had given her Lisa Chen and Carter and Chen Advisory Group and 5 clients who trusted her and a legal pad full of names and a future that was genuinely measurably hers. It had given her back herself, not the version of herself she had been at 26 before the choices that had narrowed her life to fit someone else's. Not a restored version unchanged by everything that had happened. A new version older, harder, in some places more honest about what she needed and what she would no longer accept. A woman who knew the exact weight of what she had been carrying because she had finally fully put it down. She turned onto her side. She thought about the last thing Daniel had said before going upstairs that evening, after the conversation with Sophie had finished and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet. He had paused at the bottom of the stairs and looked at her with that expression she could never entirely read, the one that was too old for 17, that sometimes made her wonder what he was going to be like at 30 and 40 and 50. He had said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" She had said, "What?" That he spent all that time trying to make sure you had nothing, and you ended up building something better than what he had. He paused. I think that's the part that would bother him most if he really understood it. Emily had looked at her son. "I think you might be right," she said. He had nodded in the way of someone who has made his peace with something complicated. "Night, Mom," he said, and went upstairs. Now, lying in the dark, she let that sit with her. He had tried to make sure she had nothing, and she had built Carter and Chen Advisory Group with 7 clients in 90 days, with a woman who had believed in her since they were both 20 years old, in a kitchen that was hers, in a house that her children slept in a life that she recognized as her own. He had tried to make sure she had nothing. And what she had now, not perfect, not without its costs, not without the marks of everything that had happened, what she had now was real, earned. Hers in a way that nothing built on a lie can ever be anyone's. She thought about Michael, not with anger, not with grief, with something that had traveled a long way from both to arrive at something cleaner, the simple, clear-eyed recognition of a person who had made choices and was living inside them, who had built an architecture of control and watched it fall, who was now, according to James, learning for the first time in his life what it felt like to be in a situation he could not manage his way out of. She hoped, with the complicated honesty of a person who has loved someone and been betrayed by them and survived it, that somewhere in that experience Michael Whitmore would find something real, something that was not strategy, something that was not management, something that was just true. She did not know if he would. She could not know. That was his journey, and it had nothing to do with hers anymore. She closed her eyes. The last thing she thought about before she slept was Grace's drawing. The courthouse with the rainbow over it. She had found it on the counter the morning after the ruling and put it on the refrigerator with a magnet where it had been for weeks, slightly crumpled at one corner, absolutely sincere. A 9-year-old's instinct about how the story ended. She had been right. Emily Carter fell asleep. She slept the way you sleep, when you have carried something enormous for a very long time, and you have finally, truly, completely set it down. The deep, unhurried sleep of a person who has stopped bracing for what comes next, because what comes next is hers, and she has already decided she can handle it, and she is not afraid. The truth had taken a year. It had cost everything. It cost and given back what it gave, and the accounting was not simple and would never be simple. But it was honest, and honest was the only kind of math that Emily Carter was interested in anymore. She had walked into a courtroom carrying nothing but what she knew. She had walked out carrying everything she deserved, and the woman who had once been told in the most careful and convincing language that a practiced liar could construct that there was nothing left, that woman was awake now and building, and she was not stopping, not for anyone, not ever again.